The following disclaimer is for those in California only. Pursuant to California Assembly Bill 2571, it is illegal for the advertisement and or marketing of any firearm-related products and or programs in a manner that is designed, intended, or reasonably appears to be attractive to minors. As such, if you are currently in California, this program is restricted to only those that are over 18. Please turn this program off now if you are in California and under 18. Now, on to the program. Hello and welcome to the centertenspodcast. Center is a podcast that discusses small bore and precision air rifle from junior shooting sports on up to NCAA collegiate and Olympic competition. And now here's your host, Adam Pearson. Hello and welcome back to Center. Hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving and survived their tryptophan comas from eating all the turkey. Since we have no competitions to review for this week, we're going to look at the top teams for NCAA selections as they currently stand. We'll look at what their top three scores were and where they were. So starting off with the number one team, West Virginia. They have an average score of 4749.33. Their top three matches for their scoring, they competed against Akron at their home range on October 7th. They scored a 47-51 that day. Their second match on October 14th at Ole Miss, they scored a 47-49. And then their third match was at TCU against TCU Nebraska on October 28th, and that was for 47-48. So they got some pretty high scores there. Right behind them is TCU with a 47-41.33 average. Their top scores were on November 5th at Alaska against TCU. They scored a 47-46. Then November 12th, they scored a 47-40 against UTEP. And then their third score was Navy and VMI at the Naval Academy on September 23rd for a 47-38. Currently in third place is Kentucky. They got an average score of 47-31. Their top three scores on November 19th against Akron and Alaska at the Tenaya Valley Shooters Association. They scored a 47-45. Their second score was on October 14th against Morehead State at Kentucky. That was a 47-27. And then they scored a 47-21 on November 18th against Akron at Alaska Fairbanks. And the number 4 spot is Alaska Fairbanks. They have an average score of 47-29.67. Their top three scores on November 19th against Akron and Kentucky, they scored a 47-45. Then on October 14th against Ohio State at Alaska, they scored a 47-23. And then their third score was a 47-21 on November 5th against TCU at TCU. Ole Miss holds the 5th spot with an average score of 47-24.67. Their top three scores, the first one was on October 14th at WVU. They scored a 47-30. Then their second score is a 47-29 against Akron at Kentucky on November 4th. And then on October 7th, they scored a 47-15 against Murray State at Murray State. In the sixth position is Georgia Southern. They got an average score of 47-24. Their top scores was on November 11th against Ole Miss at Ole Miss. They scored a 47-24. Then at home against Wofford on November 5th, they scored a 47-24. And then at Memphis against Memphis, they scored a 47-24. So actually they scored three 47-24s for their average. Nebraska holds the number 7 spot, average score of 47-18. Their top scores was on October 15th against Air Force. At Air Force was a 47-28. Then at TCU against WVU on October 29th, they scored a 47-22. And then at the Citadel on November 4th, they scored a 47-04. And holding the final spot in 8th position is Air Force. They've got an average score of 47-16.67. Their top three scores was on October 7th against UTEP at Air Force. They scored a 47-25. Then at Army against the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard on November 4th, they scored a 47-16. And then their third score is a 47-09 on November 11th against WVU, Nebraska, and Murray State at the WVU range. So those are currently who's holding the top 8 spots for going to the NCAAs. The next closest teams that have a chance of potentially moving up into those spots. Right now, Ohio State holds 9th position. They got an average score of 4711.67. Their top scores was at Alaska on October 14th with a 47-15. Then on November 19th against UTEP at UTEP, they scored a 47-12. And then against Alaska at Tenaya Valley Shooters Association on October 13th, they scored a 47-08. Just below Ohio is Murray State in 10th with an average of 4710.67. Their top scores was on November 18th against Jacksonville State and UT Martin at Jacksonville. They had a 47-17. Then on November 5th against Murray State and UTEP at Ohio State, they scored a 47-13. At home against Ole Miss, they scored a 47-02. In 11th is Akron with an average of 47-09. Their top scores, November 19th against Alaska and Kentucky, they scored a 47-16. Then on November 18th against Alaska, or against just Kentucky at Alaska, they scored a 47-12. And then on November 4th against Ole Miss, they scored a 46-99. Final one that could possibly have a chance of moving up would be Memphis in 12th. They got an average of 47-07. Their top 3 scores on October 29th at Ohio against Ohio and Moorhead, they scored a 47-10. Then at home on October 15th against WVU, they scored a 47-06. So the final score is a 47-05 on November 11th against Kentucky. So that's where the current NCAA standings are. To move up into positions, as long as the top 8 hold their spots, Ohio needs to pick up about 15 points, Murray State 18, Akron 23, and Memphis 29. So it's doable for Ohio State and Murray. Akron and Memphis have a little bit more work to do to get possibly to jump up, but that's as long as those top 8 teams don't increase their standings and move up a little bit more. So we have 2 matches that are actually coming up. The first one's going to be on December 2nd. It's VMI, John Jay, and Wolford all competing at VMI. And then on December 6th, we're going to see Air Force and Alaska Fairbanks competing at the Air Force Academy. And that'll finalize the fall season for shooting. And then we won't see any more until the January 13th, when we will start seeing about 4 or 5 different matches that weekend and then moving on from there. So that'll be it for this week. Check out our show notes at centertens.com for links to scorecards and other information we discuss. So thank you for listening, and remember, the most important shot is always the one that is in front of you. Thank you for listening to Season 1 of Center Tens. If you like the show, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast and Spotify. This helps out tremendously. Give us a follow on Instagram and Facebook at Center Tens. Center Tens can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Buzzsprout, Pocket Cast, and at centertens.com. Hope you join us for our next episode.